You are now listening to the Hunter's Advantage podcast. We preserve the history and sport of hunting through curious conversation and action-packed hunts, as well as offering you tips and strategy for more successful hunts. Hey guys, welcome to the Successful Seasons series for the Hunter's Advantage podcast, where the whole goal of this series is to break down the tactics and reasons that folks are consistently successful on harvesting big whitetails, whether on public land or on private. We're going to dig into some of the highlights of these folks' successful seasons, and then talk about some of the mistakes they made and how they would correct them. If you want to learn from some absolute whitetail killers from across the country, this is the series for you. Let's get into Successful Seasons. All right, so today on the podcast, we have a very, very special guest. We usually only have one very special guest, which is Jake, but this week we have another Jay. I teased it on the last podcast. We have John Eberhart coming in today. For the folks that don't know John, he's known as the godfather of saddle hunting. 54 years of hunting experience, a big buck killer, and he's killed 20 deer on out-of-state trips. I think he has 34 bucks in the Michigan record book. This guy is he's an absolute killer, and I think widely respected across the deer hunting space. Jake, you pretty excited for this episode?
Yeah, I'm pretty pumped for this. Really kind of hopefully touch the basics of, the postseason scouting, possibly the midsummer scouting. I already know from other podcasts that he's really not a fan of that midsummer. He really likes to stick with the postseason. And then what he's most famous for is hunting pressured bucks, which I think all of our viewers, I don't think if you listen to this, you have a 3,000 acre piece that is well managed and has quality deer management written all over it. But if you do, congrats. Send us a message. Yep. But I'm super stoked for this one.
All right. So with that, let's get into the conversation with John Eberhart. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Hunter's Advantage podcast. This is episode number 140. And today we're joined by a special guest, John Eberhart. We really appreciate you jumping on, John. How's it going?
Thank you. I would imagine all your guests are special.
How'd you know?
Yeah, it's going pretty good. Going real well.
That's great. For folks that don't know you, for those folks that maybe that are, living under a rock and don't consume any deer hunting content, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you cut your teeth on hunting, what kind of properties, all that sort of stuff?
Well, I have 100% always exclusively hunted either public or free knock-on doors for permission properties. Nobody in my family hunted, so I'm self-taught. Been hunting since the mid-1960s, so about 54 years, I think. Bow hunting primarily is what I do. I have 54 bucks in the record books, 2 with a muzzleloader, the rest are all with bow. 49 of those were taken out of a saddle. I started saddle hunting in 1981, and I think I've hunted 18 different parcels of public lands in Michigan. I've got 34 bucks in the book in Michigan, and then I've got 20 Pope and Young bucks from out of state. And I hate to sound egotistical, but I don't think there's anybody else out there that's hunted exclusively public and free permission properties that has that number of book bucks. I don't know. Right. Maybe there is. I don't know, but I've never heard of anybody. So I'm pretty proud of that statistic.
Oh, absolutely. Has that changed much through the years? Mainly like talking about the door knocking, because it seems like everybody and their dog somewhat hunts now. And so I would think that, especially if you go out of state, you're an out of stater, you're not really well known. I feel like especially now the no's are a little bit more harder no's, if that makes sense.
It does. And there's a couple of reasons. Obviously, more people are leasing up farmers' properties, which is keeping, blue collar guys out. Liability issues are a big deal. Farmers are always concerned about getting sued anymore. I've been sued before, so
really?
I know what that is.
Goodness.
And it's become very, very much more difficult. Back in the 60s and 70s, as a bow hunter, I'd knock on somebody's door and, say, hey, you mind if I bow hunt? And they'd say, you want to bow hunt? That wasn't bow hunters, especially in the 60s. And they would say, yeah, knock yourself out. They wouldn't let you gun hunt, but they'd let you bow hunt because, we had like 1 million gun hunters back in those days. So everybody gun hunted, but there was very, very few bow hunters. I would say over the last 20 years, since this whole land management and everybody wants to kill big bucks, so they buy property and keep everybody off and grow big bucks. Ever since that started to come to fruition, it's been very difficult to get free hunting permission. I have 2 private parcels I hunt now, and I've hunted one since 2007 and another one, and it's like 40 acres of huntable land. And then the other one I've hunted probably since 2012, someplace in there. And I haven't received any other free permission, even though I've tried. So It's become very, very difficult, even out of state. When I first started going to Kansas in 2004, and when I took my first trip to Iowa in 1997, I just ordered plat books. The plat books had phone numbers of the property owners, for every county and township, and basically just cold call. And I'd always go out there with free permission before I even left the door. I'd always back up, walk on in public lands to hunt. But yeah, it was not that difficult to get permission, and that's 100% changed now.
That's nuts.
I can imagine.
Yeah. In fact, it's so different now. I can remember I was doing seminars at the Wisconsin Deer and Turkey Expo, which is in Madison. And it was maybe 5 years ago. I don't remember the exact year. And I had a guy come to my booth because I had a booth there selling books and stuff because I've written books and produced DVDs, instructional stuff. And I had a guy from Iowa stop by my booth, and I'm in Wisconsin. And he actually lived in Zone 5 of Iowa, which is one of the key zones. It's in the south center of Iowa, southern border. And he said, and he was in his late 60s. And he said, man, I used to be able to hunt any place around me. He was a bow hunter, strictly a bow hunter. And he said, now all of my neighbors have leased up everything or sold it, to rich hunters from the east. And he said, I don't have any place to hunt anymore. So I come here to Wisconsin and hunt public land because there's a lot more of it in Wisconsin than there is in Iowa.
That's a shame. I remember my uncle's like 16 years older than me. And I remember he was just telling me in the 90s, it was like, wasn't even really asking permission. Like we grew up in Northeast Oklahoma. It was more of informing people what you were going to be doing. Like on their place.
We're going to be on your property.
Yeah, I know. It's so counter of what we've seen just in recent years. I mean, it's such a big cash grab now. I mean, there's so much money in it. Everybody wants to shoot big deer with video and content. And like you said, land management, it's just a completely different game now.
It's definitely changed things. I don't like where hunting is going, but it is what it is. So I deal with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so we've been doing this series on the podcast called Successful Seasons. And so really the whole goal of the series is like to break down tactics and reasons that folks are consistently successful in harvesting like big whitetails, and especially with an emphasis like on across the country and like different environments. And so we thought you would be a great guest for that, this series in particular. But kind of just starting at a high level, how was this past deer season for you? Where were you hunting? What were the goals, and how did it end up going?
Well, for the last probably 6 or 7 years, me and my 2 boys always have planned, the years we get drawn, a hunt to Kansas. And we usually go out there during Michigan's gun season. So I always suffer with all the other bow hunters in Michigan, because Michigan is the most heavily bow hunting pressured state in the country, by about 60,000 over the next closest state. So I suffer here because that's what I write about. That's what I talk about, is hunting heavily hunted deer. So that's what I suffer with everybody here until gun season, hunting public lands and those 2 private parcels. And this year I took one nice buck in Michigan, and I rattled him in out of a cornfield on October 15th. And it was kind of interesting because I think I had 16, maybe 18 cameras out, and I use cell cameras. I was definitely not a motion camera fan prior to cell cams because they involved intrusions to pull your cards, which are negative to that particular location. But now Exodus, I'm using a lot of Exodus cameras. I love them. They work great. And I had 18 cameras out in Michigan, and I only had one buck that I would want to shoot. One buck that was borderline making buck. So on October 3rd, I do a lot of rattling. I look at, there was a lot of standing corn in my areas this year, even on some public lands that butted up to, private. Just seemed like everything I had was standing corn, butting up or on the property.
It doesn't sound like a bad thing.
It's great. I love standing corn. Most people hate standing corn. I embrace standing corn.
Yeah.
Because when you can hunt along edges of standing corn and you know how to do it, they're free hunts. Most of your rut phase locations, which is what most people key their, vacation time on, is during the rut phases, because that's when 55 to 65% of bucks are taken. Your rut phase stands are back in the timber. They're back in the swamps. They're back in the bedding areas. They're back where there may be a stand of oaks on a ridge or something. So they're back in the timber. So if you've got property and it's butting up to standing corn, timber butting up to standing corn, as long as you've got excellent security cover off the standing corn side, so you get standing corn butting up to timber where there's excellent security cover around the area you want to hunt, it's not that difficult to rattle bucks out of corn, because there's a good percentage of especially the bigger bucks that are bedding in those standing cornfields. So on October 3rd, I rattled in that buck, the biggest one I had on camera, which was the third day of season on an evening hunt. I rattled him in, and he came into 5 yards, and I drew on him twice, standing there broadside at 5 yards, and then I let my bow up because he's just a borderline buck. He's a good one, but he's still borderline.
What do you mean borderline? Like, what's your borderline?
Pope and Young?
125.
Okay.
So I let the bow up, and then, within 30, 40 seconds, he walked back into the standing corn. And after he did, I said, John, you're an ass. You just let the biggest buck you have on camera, and of all your cameras, walk. I let him walk. So I thought about that on my way home. And then after that, because I hadn't seen anything bigger, in previous days after that, he became my target buck. So the buck I passed up at 5 yards, my target buck. And then on October 15th, I ended up rattling him out of the same cornfield, but in a different location. The odds of in a heavily hunted area, the odds of rattling a big buck out of a corn to a specific corn edge location, it's pretty rare that you could do that twice. He's not going to be fooled twice. So I rattled him in from a different tree, probably a couple hundred yards from the tree I rattled him in on October 3rd. But when you can do rattle sequences, or you can hunt transition routes into standing corn or coming out of standing corn in the morning, they have the security cover for that, for daytime movements by a mature buck, I consider those free hunts, because you're not interfering or intruding into the timber whatsoever. So you're not interfering with your rut phase location.
Okay.
If I go out and I scout, and let's say I'm scouting 3 or 4 pieces of public land during postseason, which as soon as the snow melts, and let's say I find a couple bedding areas, and I don't plan on hunting them during the rut. I have other locations during the rut phases that I think are better. During season, that's another spot. I will go into those public land bedding areas, like during that October lull, and I'll do rattle sequences and try and rattle something in, because I'm not going to hunt that during the rut phases. So I view all of that stuff as just free hunts. They're not hurting anything whatsoever. So they're just freebies. And I rattled in 16 bucks between October 1 and October 15th in Michigan.
That's
only one of them was a shooter, and I rattled him in twice, and I shot him on the 15th, but I rattled in, 14 other bucks at different times. Now, 3 different times they came in bachelor groups. So once on public land, I rattled in 4 bucks out of in a swamp. But 4 bucks came in together, and they were all subordinate. There was one 2.5-year-old 8-point, maybe 80 inches. And 2 other times along standing corn, I rattled in 3 one time and 4 another, and they were all 1.5 years old. So, just saying rattling in deer, bucks, they're not all shooters. So,
right. Yeah.
But still, it's fun. And I rattled in another 10 bucks after the 15th between Michigan and Kansas, because Michigan's a 2 buck state, so I kept hunting.
It's crazy to me that you're doing that on rattle them in on public land, just because from our experience in Oklahoma, it's like people play the grunt flute and they play the rattle drums. Like they walk around like they're a marching band, and you hear people on the ground. It doesn't matter where they are, they're doing it. What do you attribute those pressured bucks to, responding to that rattling to? Is it because you have so much cover in those standing cornfields that they have to come check it out if they want to have any idea and they can't see, or what do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I think because there's security cover in the corn where they're coming from almost all. When I rattled along the corn, I don't think there was any buck that I rattled in that came from the timber side. They were always out of the corn. So you got security cover to security cover, so they feel comfortable coming into that maybe 5-yard buffer between the corn and the edge of the timber to check out what's there. Same thing in a bedding area. Most people, when I do my scouting here on public land, I see tree stands all over the place in open timber, places where I wouldn't even consider hunting. So people that are doing grunt calls and rattling sequence, all they're doing is educating deer not to go into those types of areas in the daytime. That's all they're doing. So when you get back into areas where you got heavy security cover, like the corn butting up to security cover timber on the one side, or back in a bedding area in a swamp, tamarack swamp, or whatever that may be on public land, those deer feel comfortable getting up and moving during daylight hours in that heavy security cover. Obviously, if you're doing it out in open timber or along edges where you've got maybe a swamp butting up to open timber, a mature buck in a heavily pressured area is not going to come out to the edge and be exposed in that open area. He's just not going to do it. In Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, states like that, yeah, they'll walk across a 2-inch tall winter wheat field to come to something. But in a heavily pressured area, it's not going to happen. Everything has to be security cover oriented.
Yeah. Right. So speaking of the heavily pressured area, I know you've hunted like Missouri, Ohio, Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, and then Michigan. And I heard on a earlier podcast that you said Michigan was the most pressured. Does that still hold true to this day?
Oh, yeah. Michigan, well, when I say it's most pressured, we have more licensed bow hunters than any other state. And our state's also a 2-buck state. So, people can kill one and then continue hunting, like Ohio. Most of your big buck states are 1-buck states. Ohio's a 1-buck state. Indiana's a 1-buck state. A 1-buck state.
That's the way Oklahoma is. Oklahoma's a 2-buck state, but it's almost like we get kind of hit with the double whammy at times because there's a muzzleloader season and then a rifle season. The way it works in Oklahoma is you can take one, like you can fill both your buck tags using a muzzleloader and then a rifle. And to make it even worse is the rifle season is like, when I say the peak rut, it's the peak rut here. And that's when stuff really hits the fan.
Yeah, ours is during our gun season opens right dead center of peak rut.
Yeah, it's always kind of funny because it's just like, man, I wonder what happened to that buck. He's not on camera, which again, gunshots are going off and stuff. So you expect them to be a little bit more, tucked back into the timber and stuff, and then you start scrolling through Facebook and it's like, oh, neighbor's got him.
There he is.
It's always fun.
I was gonna say I used to gun hunt up until 1991 here, and if you didn't kill a buck opening day, you're on
good luck. Yeah,
buck after opening day was pretty close to zero because any mature buck, they are just buried in a swamp someplace. And
right.
They don't move till daylight. Usually till sometime in January. Month and a half after the season.
I'm with you on that. I'm with you.
There was a guy that I was talking to. He said that in Northeast Texas they shoot it at sound. It ain't even sight. Like they just hear something and they're just boom shooting that direction.
That to make sure you didn't go on his property.
Yeah,
probably.
Yeah. It seems like once a year somebody in Northeast Texas gets killed deer hunting. It's like dude, how people just shoot at sound. It's like, man, they don't even want to get a mature buck. They just want to get a buck.
I think it's legal to shoot trespassers in Texas.
Texas is its own country. Okay.
Texas is definitely its own country, and deer hunters out there, you just don't trust that.
Oh, that's funny.
That's
so
not heard of.
You said you've been hunting 54 years. Was there, and I'm sure there's some little nugget, even in 54 years in, that you're picking up every single season. What was something that you maybe learned, or a detail that you honed in on a little more this season that you maybe hadn't spent a lot of time in or hadn't learned the previous seasons?
Jeez, that's a good question. Something I picked up this season.
Maybe you had a flush deer out of corn. Maybe that's one.
Well, I did learn something. I learned something in Kansas because I've been going to Kansas since 2004. I've probably been there 15 times maybe, because there was years I didn't get drawn. And I learned that during arid seasons, that buck antlers don't grow the same as normal. So this year, me and my two boys, we had out a lot of cameras, and typically by the 22nd to 23rd of November, we always go out there during the end of their peak rut leading into their post ruts. We always go out there in late November. And typically by November 22nd, 23rd, it's almost to the day, the majority of does have been bred. So now those bigger bucks, those dominant bucks that have been doed up pretty much since we got there, now they have to actually get up off their butts and go search for late estrus does, just like they had to search for early estrus does during the pre-ride. And on our cameras that we had out this year, 90%, 80-something, it was real close to 90% of the mature bucks, of all the bucks actually that we got on camera, had broken antlers by the 22nd or 23rd of November. Typically, it's about 50%. Someplace between 45 and 55% have busted up antlers by the 22nd or 23rd coming out of peak rut, because there's so much fighting that goes on, because there's so many bucks out there compared to the does. You know, their buck to doe ratios, antlered buck to mature doe day ratios are pretty even. In fact, we usually see more bucks than we do does. So I was kind of wondering why. And then I was talking to some farmers out there, and they said they had 0.35 inches of rain from June 15th through mid-November. 0.35 inches of rain. Yeah. So almost every farmer, every farmer I did talk to, they were collecting crop insurance, because the crop yields, they just weren't getting. I talked to one farmer, he did 3 acres of soybeans where he actually harvested them, and he was getting 4 bushel per acre. He had to do that just to prove to the insurance company the yield, okay? So the same minerals that go into growing bone on antlers are the same minerals that grow crops. So obviously, if the crops are not growing, getting their normal yields, the bucks their antlers were more brittle. I don't think they were as dense. And I think that's why so many antlers were busted up by the end of, peak rut. Because when we go out there, we leave on the 16th. We arrive late at night on the 16th, because we leave at like 5 a.m. in the morning. And then we go to bed and we get up on the 17th. And all we do the first 2 days, we have an 11-day trip because we want to hunt 7 days. So the first 2 days, all we do is scout and prep locations. So usually by the 19th in the morning, we have usually 10 to 12 locations prepped and ready to go. And that's when we actually start hunting. Usually I'm so wore out because I prep all the trees, even though my kids are 50 years old. I like to prep the trees myself, because I want the steps on for my saddle to be nice and even. I don't want to take any jerky motions. I want everything smooth. And so I usually sleep in on the morning of the 19th and start my hunting on the 19th in the evening, because I don't really get serious until the 22nd or 23rd, because from the 19th until the 22nd, we see a lot of 2.5 and an occasional 3.5-year-old buck. We're seeing, 115 to 135 bucks. But we're not seeing those 150s that we're targeting and bigger. And we don't start seeing those until we see them on camera. We get them on our cameras at night, but we don't start seeing them in the daytime until after that 22nd, 23rd time frame. And that's one of the cool things about Kansas is their gun season opens in December. They have a September muzzleloader season. Yeah, like it should as a bow hunter.
Yep.
So, you can go out there during post rut and continue to bow hunt prior to their gun season. So deer are still in their normal movement habits.
Yeah, we spent our first fall in Southeast Kansas this year, and it was incredible. The early season hunting was amazing. The late season, we were still seeing Pope and young quality bucks all the way up into the last day of season. But we hunted that first 2 weeks in November in Kansas, probably the worst hunting experience we've ever had with the people. Like you said, that second half in November, I think that's going to be the ticket for us going forward, because I saw more people than deer. And I know Kansas has a lot of deer because I saw them all all early season and all post or late season too. It was tough.
That's another great point, because when we're out there during post rut, late November, we don't see anybody. Everybody takes their trips out, whether it be Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Dakotas. Everybody goes the last week of October through the second week of November. Everybody that takes that time frame for trip.
Yeah, in early season, like late September, I think it was almost like you had like your own personal like bean field yourself, and you didn't have to do any of the work. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
And
absolutely.
You were still seeing like 20 plus deer. Now, granted, I don't know which one would be better. I don't know if you have a preference on hunting early or late season.
I always prefer hunting during the rut phases in Michigan.
Rut phases.
I have never hunted out there that early, so I can't intelligently speak about hunting that early in Kansas, because like I said, I always suffer with all the other Michiganders during the early part of the season. So I always, anytime I've ever went out of state anywhere, it's always been either late season, like mid-December after the gun season's end, like in Illinois, or, during Michigan gun season.
Well, it's almost like the Kansas gun season, and again, I can only speak on Oklahoma gun season. It's almost like they're like two different deer, if that makes sense, because after gun season in Oklahoma, you can't catch even on private land. You can rarely catch a deer out in the middle of the field. We went late season, and it was after or during gun season. I don't remember, but it was like December something, and we were seeing deer eat like just basically in the middle of these bean fields that they left little strips of beans. And we're not like big ag hunters, because Oklahoma doesn't have like the management style that Kansas does.
Right.
But those like little strips of standing beans that they were leaving, we were seeing some pretty good bucks just after or during gun season, just standing out there. And it's just like, you wouldn't see that in Oklahoma.
No. Yeah, you wouldn't in Michigan. I mean, I can remember the first time I went to Iowa and I watched this 150 plus inch 8-point walk across a 2-inch winter wheat field, walking right towards the road. I parked on the road, and no, I'm sorry, it was in Kansas in 2004, first time in Kansas. And this buck was like 2 hours before dark, and he's walking across the field right towards where my vehicle is. I'm parked on the road. He was going to cross the road. He got about 50 yards from the road, and he just kind of looked at my car and stared at me for a while with the window down, and I turned around and walked back. Like, no big deal. I was like, that would never happen at all.
You didn't press a little harder on that gas pedal to, maybe bump into them, or, 150 inch 8. I mean, people do some stupid things.
I actually had permission to hunt that piece of property, and I set up.
I got you.
And I had him at about 35 yards, but I didn't take that shot. Just wasn't comfortable with 35. But I killed a good buck on that trip, so I was cool.
There you
Probably,
go.
If I had to pick one thing that I think would be advantageous to hunters, that most hunters don't believe in, would be scent control. I struggle. This is my most major struggle in the deer hunting world. A deer's major, they got eyes, ears, and nose. So they got three major senses, basically: vision, sight, hearing, and smelling. But smelling is definitely their main thing as far as keeping themselves alive, their nose. And, I've been using activated carbon line clothing since 1997, and by 1999, I had researched the technology and got to a point where I pay zero attention to wind. I've paid zero attention to wind since late 98 or 99. And I struggle to comprehend why hunters don't take advantage of such a serious technology that totally alleviates wind direction. That just boggles my mind.
Now, I might be one of those, but because like to be able to be like completely scent free, because I've listened to a lot of the podcasts you've been on and stuff like that, but to be completely scent free and to go to those extremes, I guess it could be laziness, but it is a lot of work. It is a lot of work because I think of all the times where
you spend in prepping your locations and scouting and getting up in the mornings and buying clothes and figuring out what layer garments you're going to wear,
Too much not to kill a deer.
It's a lot of work when you first get started at the process. Once you learn the process, it's no different than regular hunting. All the preparation for scent control is basically done at home. When I drive and pull up to a spot to go hunting, I slip between my seats in my van and I just put on my, sunlock jacket and sunlock pants, my layers underneath it. I have stripped down and put my layers on, then my sunlock jacket and pants, grab my backpack and bow and walk out the door. I guarantee I'd be out of my van door ready to walk in the field before you would. No matter what you were using to hunt in as far as clothing.
Yeah, that's kind of like hanging the saddle, right? Like hanging sticks and getting in the saddle. It took me like 30 minutes the first time. Now it's like I'm up pretty quick, probably pretty quick that nowadays. The scent control thing, though, it blows my mind, and I can't fully wrap my mind around it because the first 15 years that I hunted, we didn't care about the wind either, but we didn't kill very many deer either. So, we always used scent control in form of spray. Right. We never played the wind. I didn't start playing the wind until I was 20 years old. And I started dramatically increasing the amount of mature bucks that I was shooting. Right. I could always kill a 2.5 or a 3.5-year-old deer, but mature deer, I started almost every mature deer on my walls came post playing the wind. Right. But playing the wind is extremely limiting on when you can hunt and the locations that you can hunt. And so, it's interesting to me that you don't have to play the wind. And with that being said, like, what is a little bit, without getting too deep into the weeds, how do you do that? Like what with carbon capture technology, I think is what you said.
Yeah.
Can you explain that just a little bit? Because to me, it's uncomprehendable from someone who still plays the wind.
Well, to back up a little bit, for the first 35 years I hunted the wind exclusively. Mm-hmm. And when you hunt the wind exclusively, sometimes some years your best rut phase locations don't get hunted because you don't have the day off on the days the wind is right. So, there's just a lot of times you don't get to hunt your best locations because you have to pay attention to wind. And when you said scent free, I don't think there's such a term as scent free. I think you just knock your human odor down to like 1 or 2% of it escapes. And that's not enough to make a deer think you're an immediate threat. If they get any human odor in their nose, they just think it's a long distance away and they don't even think about it, because they will in most every area in the country except a certain amount of human odor, 1 or 2% of what your human body can produce. So in 97, Miles Keller was always a big, I was always a big fan of him. You guys probably never even heard about him.
I've heard of that. I've heard of him.
Big time bow hunter before being a big time buck killer was cool, and he did it the real way. He actually went out and hunted deer. He didn't grow them and then just kill them like a lot of TV guys do. He actually would find them and then get permission to hunt on the properties because it was primarily in the 80s and it was easier to get permission. And he'd get permission and go out and target them and kill them. And he actually used scent lock and had a little bit of success with it. So I bought some, and the instructions that it came with were, in my opinion, not worthy of not having to worry about the wind. They just didn't give you the proper instructions for properly caring for activated carbon clothing, in my opinion. And so I researched the technology. I knew a lot about activated carbon before I even bought that suit. And I researched the technology. I played with different things as far as deabsorbing it. You can't reactivate it. That's impossible. So you have to deabsorb it. It's like wringing a sponge out, getting rid of most of the water, but it'll still absorb more. So I figured out finally, I had jacket, pants, gloves, head cover. You have to have the head cover with the drop down face mask. That's a 100% must, because 40% of your odor comes out of your hair follicles in your face and your beard. So I was doing that and having a lot more success as far as, not getting winded as often. And then I was like, okay, well, why am I getting winded at all? What else might I be doing? Obviously, I was wearing rubber boots, so there's no odor on that. But then I thought about my backpack. I'm in my backpack every day with my bare hands, reloading it for the next hunt all throughout the season. So here I am. I've got a scent lock suit on up in a tree, and I've got this huge human scent wick in the tree with me in the form of my backpack. So I ended up getting some scent lock fabric and having a backpack made. So I deabsorb that the same as I would my suit every so often. And I keep everything in an airtight container. So it's because activated carbon doesn't know whether you're hunting or whatever you're doing. It's absorbing molecules 100% of the time. It's exposed to an outside environment. So once you deabsorb it in a dryer and you put it in an airtight container, and then once you stop your vehicle, you put on all your base garments, undergarments, and then you open that tote up and put on your scent lock suit and gloves and head cover and backpack, you're pretty much scent free, 98% scent free, I would say. And that was actually proven because scent lock got sued about 8 years ago, maybe even a little bit longer. And in a U.S. court ruling, I think it ended up in a Florida district court, U.S. district court, and they actually sent scent lock garments to Rutgers University, where they have science labs where they actually study activated carbon for industries and stuff like that, other types of uses, because it's used by NASA. Every chemical warfare suit on Earth uses activated carbon, paint respirators, just tons and tons of uses. And they actually tested some scent lock suits, and they, in the actual ruling, the dismissal ruling of this case, they put in print in the court dismissal by the judge, in expert testing, Rutgers University used likely 10,000 times more molecules than the human body could produce in a 24-hour period, and the scent lock still absorbed 96.5 to 99+% of all human odor molecules, of all the molecules.
Wow.
So using 10,000 times more than you could produce in 24 hours, it still absorbed over 96% of them. Yeah,
that's almost incomprehensible for my small mind. But how do they test something like that? Do you know?
I think they put activated carbon in a container, and then they put fabric actually in the container with it. I actually have an actual document on how they did that. I got it from Rutgers because I actually talked to one of the guys that did it years ago. And then they can test it. They have, electron microscopes that can.
Is it like bacteria based? You think like bacteria from like
odor from bacteria? Is your odor from bacteria?
I would think so. Just
yeah, it is. You have about.
I ain't no science major, so I don't know.
You have over 300 different types of molecules, odor molecules, that are basically coming out of your body 100% of the time you're breathing. Now, bacteria is actually an organism, so it is putting out odor molecules as well. Now, there's a lot of antimicrobial garments out there that actually kill bacteria if they're worn against the skin. So most of them are treatments. Now, some of them are silver. Some of them are silver lined, which is a natural antimicrobial. The U.S. military uses silver for antimicrobial for socks and underwear, for crotch itch and for feet. That's just a fact.
Yeah.
But anyway, antimicrobials, all they do is they physically kill bacteria. They do nothing to absorb odor from the dead bacteria. So they kill bacteria so it doesn't multiply as rapidly. So it cuts down on that. But still, you have lots of other gases and liquid in the form of sweat and perspiration molecules coming out of that. So bacteria is a big one. But even wearing an antimicrobial garment against your skin, while it's going to kill bacteria, does nothing to get rid of the odor from that bacteria, and it does nothing for any of the other odor molecules that you are excreting through your skin, or mouth, or nose, or ears.
So I got to play devil's advocate for a minute. So let's say not an average person, a way above average volume hunter hunts 75 days a year, harvests 1 or 2 bucks a year. Let's say if you're a volume hunter, and like say you take your approach, right? You use scent lock and activated carbon. Don't you feel like eventually, if you hunt enough times, the wind's going to be right to kill a deer? Because from my perspective, when I was growing up, and every time I killed one, it was probably the right wind. I didn't know it was the right wind. I just ended up killing one on that day. Or do you have specific anecdotal experiences where you're like, hey, I was hunting, I know on the completely wrong wind, and I still killed this deer completely downwind to me? Do you have a bunch of experiences like that too?
Both of what you just said is true, because I don't pay attention to wind, but when I'm actually going hunting or setting up a hunting location, but especially back in the early years, once I was confident in it and I was, testing it. Yeah. The first 5 to 10 years, when there was a big buck coming in from directly downwind, yeah, I was always like, okay, I hope the son of a bitch keeps coming. I would bet 50% of the mature bucks I've killed since using scent lock. And when I say scent lock, I mean activated carbon. Scent lock owns the U.S. patent on using activated carbon, so nobody else can use it, because that's why everybody else knocks it, because they can't use it without paying them a huge royalty. So, but yeah, I've shot lots of bucks that have came in from directly downwind. I've had lots of does go by me to my downwind side and keep on going. I have deer cross my entry routes all the time. Yeah, there's no doubt when you've hunted 35 years where you're 100% paying attention to wind direction, you immediately know the difference when you're not paying attention to wind direction and you're still killing any deer that comes in from downwind.
Yeah.
Any deer. Right. So, yeah, a lot of the deer I killed, they came in from upwind. So, but that I wasn't worried about it. I didn't plan it that way. The only time I ever plan a location according to wind direction is if I'm setting up at a primary scrape area, because I'm a big primary scrape area hunter. I'd say over 50% of the bucks I've shot were at scrapes of some sort. And so when I'm setting up at a primary scrape area, I'll usually set up about 25 yards on the downwind side of the scrapes from whatever the prevailing wind is, which I'm up north. Prevailing winds up here usually out of the north to northwest. So when I'm setting up a location during, postseason scouting and location prep, it's going to be on the southeast side of the scrape areas. And then I'll also clear a runway another 25 to 30 yards downwind of the tree. So if a buck comes into the physical scrape area, I'll have that shot. But if he circles to the downwind side, which is very common during midday, during the rut phases, especially pre-ride, they usually will circle to the downwind side and scent check if anything was at those scrapes, because scrapes are usually in a little open area. It's a small opening. So I'll have a shot any place up to almost 50 yards on the downwind side of that scrape area by setting up on the downwind side of the scrapes. So I actually will try. That's the only time I physically go in and hunt the wind, is I want to hunt those locations when the wind is out of the north or northwest, because deer usually come in from the downwind side. Whereas if I were set up, let's say I just went in there carte blanche because I was not paying attention to the wind, and I set up a tree on the north side of the scrapes and the wind was out of the northeast. So if a buck came 50 yards on the downwind side, I wouldn't have that shot. So by setting up on the downwind side of the prevailing winds and waiting for the prevailing wind to hunt that location, now I've upped my opportunities. I've upped my odds.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, you pay attention to the wind, but only in the context of how the deer is going to use the wind to scent check and use his scrape areas. We want to talk a lot more about that and more about pressuring or hunting pressured whitetails, because I know you've written books about this. But
we another one actually.
there you go. That was one of the questions. One of our listeners was asking if you were going to write another book. So that's awesome. That's exciting. We tell them that.
Me and some of the saddle guys are going to write a saddle hunting book, but it's going to have general deer hunting stuff in it as well.
Oh, there we go.
It's going to be it's going to be the Bible.
Saddle Bible.
Yeah. Well, deer, it's going to have, there's going to be a lot more just general hunting information in it than about saddles. I mean, you can only put so much stuff in a book about just saddle hunting. I mean,
right.
It's just the form of a tree stand. So it's just another form of hunting.
Yeah. So one of the things that we know our listeners are going to want to take away, we want to give them tangible things they can take away from an episode. And I know one of the things that you like to do is postseason scouting, which is probably different from the south to the north. I mean, you talked about how you're still waiting for that to come when the snow melts. We've already done a good amount of it. Like we just did a 10-mile day postseason scouting. One of our first times actually spending an extended amount of time postseason scouting. And I feel like the veil was pulled from my eyes this last weekend. I was like, oh my gosh, I've seen more sign. It's been easier to spot than I've ever been. You can see these subtle changes in topography that you just cannot see when all the vegetation and the green up is there too. But I just we wanted to know what does your postseason scouting strategy look like now? How much of it are you doing and why are you doing it? Because there's a lot of folks that are going to put that bow in the closet and all their stuff and the trail cameras, and they're going to sit there till the end of summer.
Well, the reason I do it is there's multiple reasons actually. There's a lot of advantages of postseason scouting. First off, like I mentioned earlier, 55 to 65, and I have this data. I did all this data collection back when I was writing my books. 55 to 65% of all book bucks in the Pope and Young record book were taking in every state during that state's rut phases. So when there's that high of a percentage of bucks taken during that 3.5 to 4 week time frame, obviously that's when you want to spend the most of your attention hunting. So up in the northern tiered states and throughout the Midwest, by the rut phase periods, which is usually late October through late November, all the foliage is pretty much down. So when you go out and when you scout your locations during preseason, all the foliage, everything looks dense. Everything looks like it's got a lot of security cover. You can't see those little terrain featured breaks and stuff like you were just talking about you could now. Okay?
Yep.
You can't see that stuff. You can see a long ways when all the foliage is down. So when you're scouting, you're looking at areas exactly like they're going to look during the rut phases when you go back. So you're not going to set up at a place during preseason for the rut phase hunting that looks dense now, and then you get back there and doesn't have the adequate security cover once the foliage is down for mature buck activity at that specific location. So postseason, you're looking at the location exactly the way it's going to look at now. You know what kind of security cover it's going to have. Also, your trees. When you're looking at prepping a location at a tree, at a spot, you're looking at the trees. Well, during preseason, the trees all have foliage in them. So you may end up setting up 18 feet up the tree, which is, in my opinion, it's pretty damn low unless you have tree foliage in the tree. Early season, it's fine because you got a lot of background cover and full cover around you. But during the rut phases, once the foliage is down, you stick out like a sore thumb at 18 feet. Now the saddle changes that because you can move around the tree and hide behind it. But still, I'm usually 22 to 28 feet to my feet during the rut phases because I want to be up out of a buck's peripheral vision. So during postseason, you're looking at the trees exactly the way they're going to look like when you go back and hunt them during the rut phases. So you prep them accordingly. You can scout every inch of the property. You can go out there every day from daylight till dark, 7 days in a row, and you're not worried about spooking deer. Because spooking deer this time of year is 100% irrelevant to fall activity. Everything's going to be back way, way before fall and in its normal routine. So you can scout every inch of the property without concern of spooking deer. You don't have to worry about scent. When you go out and you preseason scout, you're leaving lots of human odor. You know, it's usually 80 degrees in August or September when you're preseason scouting. You're sweating your ass off. You're leaving a lot of human odor.
Battling ticks, mosquitoes.
And you're making visual changes.
Yeah.
Right then and there, you are making visual changes to their habitat when you're cutting shooting lanes and stuff. Postseason, when you're doing all of that stuff, your location preparation, your alterations, clearing shooting lanes and all that stuff is irrelevant because they've got 6 months to adjust to that and make their movement habits, you know, be habitual, basically.
Basically a free scout.
Yeah, when you're setting that stuff up now and cutting shooting lanes, you know, they got 6 months to get used to everything. And, you know, going down these routes through these clearings of your shooting lanes is, you know, it's routine by that time. Whereas you go out there preseason, do that, you're leaving scent there, and mature bucks pick up on that, even if it's after dark. And they'll avoid those places, or a lot of times in areas where you got a lot of preseason scouting, like on public lands, they just turn nocturnal before season even opens. You know, they've been shot at before. Most of them up here have been wounded. I think 28 of my 34 Michigan bucks have had wounds on them.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. Yeah.
That's insane.
Wow, had 4.
Really? Oh, my God.
Yeah.
He's been
we got pictures. I took all the projectiles out of them, actually. I got pictures. So where was I? So anyway, yeah, you're not making a visual change by doing it this time of year, whereas you'd be leaving scent, changing the visual preseason, and probably altering deer habits, deer routines, especially mature buck routines, because they've been left alone since probably turkey season, probably since January. You know, you're going to have January through March where they're totally 100% left alone during the winter. And then you might have a little influx of turkey hunting activity, but then the rest of the summer, they're totally left alone. And then all of a sudden there's an influx of human activity in the form of preseason scouting on public lands and location prep. They know that gig. The ones that are 3 or 4 years old, they know that gig, and they just turn nocturnal, or they go back so deep into the bedding areas and they just don't move outside of those bedding areas during daylight hours. So there's that. And then you can also, you know, a lot of times up here in Michigan, because like right now, we just had a huge ice storm. There's a 1/4 of an inch ice on all the branches and everything south of me, about 100 miles, and branches are falling. So when you actually go out and you're doing postseason scouting, once you find a location, you can walk every runway going to it for 50 to 100 yards and, you know, pull or cut or whatever, all of the debris that's blocking the runways. Open those runways up so they're easy to transition down. And you can also block sometimes, you know, as I've aged, I'm shooting a 40-pound bow now, so my shooting range is only 25 yards. I can actually, if there's a runway that's 30, 35 yards away, that's paralleling my tree, I can actually take brush and block that runway and then slowly, gradually turn and make an opening within 25 yards of my tree. So by doing that this time of year, you know, that alteration in that runway becomes habit. If you did that preseason, you'd leave so much odor along that runway, they'd probably quit using it, especially during the early part of the season. And they go back using it during the rut, but not during the early part of the season.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of advantages to postseason scouting.
Yeah. So diving a little bit more into that postseason scouting, like if you're coming up onto a new area or something, what's the first thing you really look for? Like, is it sign? Is it terrain? Is it food? I mean, I guess it could be all, but like, what's the primary one that you really look for?
It depends on the area that I'm hunting. Like if I'm hunting big timber areas, like Southern Ohio or something like that, you know, where there's no ag for miles, I'm typically looking for mass, you know, in the form of, you know, primarily white oaks or red oaks, hickory trees. I'm looking for food. But when I'm hunting up here in Michigan, if I'm hunting in an area where there's agriculture, my key objective is to find scrape areas. Not necessarily individual scrapes along a runway, but primary scrape areas where you're going to have multiple scrapes in a small zone, because those are always put 100% of the time. The primary scrape area is always where there's a lot of doe activity.
Okay.
That's why they're there. So I'm looking for those primary scrape areas. And as I said earlier, over half of the deer I've killed in the last probably 35 years were at primary scrape areas or very near them. And a lot of times those are at mass trees. If you go out, I don't think you guys have apple trees down where you're at.
No, not really.
Okay.
Not really.
Persimmon?
A few, yep. But they're still pretty rare.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anytime you get to a preferred mast or fruit tree,
Mhm.
like white oaks are preferred up here.
We have a lot of oaks. Yeah.
A lot of
oaks. Yeah. A lot of times if you find an isolated group, let's say 3 or 4 oaks in a small little zone, that's going to be a primary feeding location. That's going to attract those. So there's a good chance there'll be some scrapes there. Apple trees up here are really key feeding locations because it's like eating candy to it.
Yeah.
They're really sweet. So you find apple trees up here in the years that they're dropping. If there's not a lot of apple trees in the area, there's only 2 or 3, those become destination feeding locations because there's only a few of them. So those are going to be feeding there, and there's going to be there's going to be scrapes there. So that's the key spot. And then for hunting in the rut phases, so my number one thing is primary scrape areas and scrapes in general. Number 2 would be food, mast, and I don't do food plots, never hunted a food plot in my life. So it's going to be preferred mast or preferred fruit. And then number 3 is interiors of bedding areas. During the rut phases, I'm almost always, I'd say 60, 70% of the time of my hunts are in interiors of bedding areas, not perimeters, interiors. Mm-hmm. If I wanted to kill one of you 2 guys, that would be to hide in your bedroom.
Yeah, that's right.
You'd be there every night. Okay.
Yeah.
Second best place would be next to the refrigerator, which is
yeah.
Not in the dining room, because you may not actually, the dining room would be considered a perimeter of a feeding area.
Right.
You may go to the refrigerator and get food and go eat in a different room. So by hunting the dining room, I'd be hunting a peripheral location as opposed to the destination location of the actual food source. You kind of follow what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Or a transition route. You look at a transition route to or from a feeding area, from a bedding area. I look at that like your driveway. If I wanted to kill one of you 2 guys and you had 3 doors in your house, I'm probably going to stake out along your driveway because you have to go into the driveway to park your car. Whereas, let's say I hung out at your front door in the weeds by your front door, you may pull in the garage and go in a different door. You have multiple options. Anytime you have multiple options, I always want to be at the destination spot. You have to pull into the driveway. So that's going to be my best opportunity to kill you. Always looking at destination locations, and because deer bed in bedding areas, that's where they are most of their lives as far as an individual area. Why in the world do you not hunt in the interiors of bedding areas? And one of the key things to hunting the interiors of bedding areas is scent control. Because when you're hunting interiors of bedding areas, 50% of the deer you see during the course of a day are probably going to be downwind of you on average. Because deer can come from any direction in a bedding area, especially if they're with does, or pursuing does, because there's no rhyme or reason to any rut activity during a rut. Routines kind of go out the window. So interiors of bedding areas, but you got to hunt them strategically as well. You have to have a really good scent control regimen, and you have to commit to all day sits. So you've got to be in your tree, settled in about an hour and a half before daybreak, and not leave until a half hour after dark. So they have to be all day sits. You got to be in there before mature bucks are going to transition into the bedding area, because they usually start transitioning into the bedding areas, in Michigan, 15 minutes to 45 minutes before daybreak. And once they get in there, they feel secure and they'll move around in there. So you have to be in there well before daylight and set up and quiet. And then I always like to leave a half hour after dark because I want the deer to leave the bedding area before I get out and transition out. So I'm not spooking anything with my entry or my exit.
The Hunter's Advantage podcast is powered by Out on a Limb Manufacturing. Out on a Limb is a family-owned company based right here in Oklahoma that makes tree stands, saddle platforms, climbing sticks, and so much more.
Christian, I have a quick question.
What's that?
What bites down harder, a hippo or an alligator?
No idea.
It's a trick question. The Ridge Runner 2.0 bites harder than both of them. But all jokes aside, we use these products all across the land on public or private. These help us get into any tree we want and hunt where the deer actually are.
Most men go to the grocery store for their meat, but these products help you go to God's grocery store. I have used the Out on a Limb Ridge Runner 2.0 and the Shakar sticks for the last few years hunting public land bucks, and I've actually shot several bucks out of this setup. If you want to support the podcast and get some Out on a Limb equipment, make sure to go to outонalimbmfg.com and use code HNTA10 for 10% off at checkout. Once again, if you want to support the podcast, go to outonalimbmfg.com and use code HNTA10 at checkout for 10% off. Now let's get back to the podcast. When he was saying that, Jake, about the oaks and stuff, that made me think a lot about there's this piece of public that we hunt in Oklahoma. It's primarily pines, primarily cedars. And one of our best, most fruitful spots, I've shot 2 really good bucks out of it on public, is a nice bowl with a bunch of pines, a bunch of cedars. It's a mother trucker to get to. I mean, your stuff's hitting you in the face the whole way in, but it's only about 400 yards off the road.
Bedding area is supposed to be.
Yeah, no, it's a bedding area. And one thing I noticed when I was dragging a buck out one time was one of our buddies came in. He was like, "Oh my God, there's white oaks all over this place." It was like bedding with food, with transition. It's like all in this one big bowl. And like you said, scent control is tough in there, but gosh dang, it's like a deer heaven if you can get in there without spooking everything out.
Yeah, that's a spot you'd kill it with a proper scent control regimen. You'd kill a buck there every year. No doubt about it. That is a key spot. All you got to do is go in there, postseason, set up next to a couple of those oaks and, hunt them accordingly. And primarily during the rut phases is when you want to hunt those. Because a lot of times during the early season, bucks will just go in a bedding area and bed down for the day. They have no reason to really get up and move around. They may get up and browse within 10 or 15 yards of their bed, but they don't have a big reason to move around. During the rut phases, they're in there. There's typically does in the area. If they have corralled a hot doe into the bedding area, they'll breed her and she'll lay down for 15 or 20 minutes and he'll maybe lay down 10 or 15 yards downwind of her. And then he'll get up and nudge her and they'll do the run through the bedding area to look for 40 or 50 yards and they'll breed her again. And they'll just go through that process all day long. So they're moving around in there a lot. So rut phases is the best time to hunt interiors of bedding areas. And maybe the first day or two are not too bad because you're going to have a 30 to 40 day break between hunting the first day or two in a bedding area and then hunting it during the rut phases. So you're going to give it a 30 to 40 day cool down period, depending on when your opening day is in your state.
Yeah, October 1. So it's pretty much exactly.
You'd have about a 25 day cool down. Because I'm assuming your rut phases are similar, maybe not. Our pre-rut starts 25th of October to the 28th. And
that's about right on.
Peak rut starts around the 5th to the 7th.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
That's exactly right. So, John, if you had just last question on the postseason scouting, because this is just fascinating to me. If you had just an average bow hunter just come up to you and ask, or say, I have 10 days to scout. I can either do this, and I can break this up in the postseason, in the preseason, in the summer, whenever. How much are you going to advise them of that time to be spent in the postseason, in the summer, and right before season to scout to be most effective on harvesting a mature buck, but one that's also pressured? So
they got 10 days to scout. What segment of the season should they be scouting for? Or like early season rut phases?
They can hunt whenever, but the time they have to scout is from February to the day before season. When would you advise them to use most of those days on scouting?
Immediately the day after all the snow has melted, if you live in a northern tiered state. If you live in a state where you don't get snow, but the rut phases are still the same as what we have, as soon as you're done hunting, as soon as the gun season's over, because a lot of times it's not safe to be scouting during gun season.
Especially in Texas.
Shooting a movement.
As soon as the snow melts, or as soon as you're capable and not worried about getting shot. And a lot of hunters have a difficult time identifying bedding areas. And I always say, whenever you're looking at a piece of property, you have to pretend everybody hunting here is trying to kill you. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at it like everybody's trying to kill me, where are the only places on this property? I've looked at aerials. I'm going in to look at this property. I know where the heavy cover is according to the aerials. I want to go and look at the places where I am going to feel the most comfortable getting up and possibly moving during daylight hours and still feeling secure doing that. So that's going to eliminate looking at open timber with no understory. It's going to eliminate open fields. It's going to eliminate edges of crop fields. It's going to eliminate, depending on the area, 50 to sometimes 90% of the areas you even have to look at.
Oh, yeah.
You're just going to be looking at heavy. If I had to tell somebody something, I don't care what state you are in, even though, Kansas's and your Nebraskas and your Dakotas and your Iowas, the deer will move in open areas pretty freely. Still, if you gravitate all of your hunting to security cover, being near or on edges of, transition security cover or in bedding areas, you're going to be very successful. As long as you're hunting the locations at the right times of season. Obviously, if you're hunting a oak tree or you're hunting an apple tree or a persimmon tree, that's a feeding destination location. So you don't hunt there in the mornings. Those are evening spots because you just moved your feeding at them in the morning with a morning entry. You have early season locations, you have morning locations, evening locations, rut phase locations. Like up here, typically our acorns in a lot of the areas where we don't have a huge amount of oaks, they're pretty much mowed up. By the end of the early season, by mid-October, they're gone. Turkeys, squirrels, all the critters are eating them, and the deer. So, those are early season locations. That's why once all the natural food base where I'm hunting is pretty much mowed up, apples, acorns, that's why I gravitate most of my attention during the rut phases to hunting back in the bedding areas. Security cover. I can't overstress that. I don't care where you hunt. Big, mature bucks will always gravitate to security cover or edges of security cover if they have the option.
So it almost sounds like you talking about like finding the bedding, like where they feel safe, the rare places, I guess they feel safe, especially like on public ground, like you hunt, and then finding, I guess, depending on what time of the season it is, you're basically just trying to find the what's the word for it? I lost it. The least common thing, like if oaks are hitting and they're like a I'm losing my words right now, but basically a limited resource, and
yep.
you're focusing on those limited resources and then exploiting them.
Yes, like if you go into, I've scouted areas where there's literally 3 or 4 acres on an oak ridge of oaks, just solid oaks. So there's no rhyme or reason for them to be at any specific one at any specific time. So you're hunting basically whatever the acreage of oaks there are, your little 30-yard or 60-yard zone, 30 yards around the tree in each direction is a pretty small cut of what could possibly be the potential up there. Whereas if you're hunting in an area and you've got an isolated oak sitting all by itself and it's got the adequate security cover or perimeter cover around it and adequate transition security cover to it from a known bedding area, yeah, that one's probably going to get a lot of the activity because you're looking at a singular feeding source as opposed to having 100 oak trees and you got to pick the one carte blanche that you think he's going to be feeding at the day you go. Is that kind of what you were talking about?
Yeah. I was just trying to basically dumb it down for people like me that like the less words, the better. You know what I mean?
There you go.
Yeah. Always look for isolated singular sign, especially when it comes to food, because that's where you're going to get your best opportunities. And like if there was deer prefer white oak acorns over red oaks, 100 to 1. I mean, it's not even a contest. They'll always mow the white oak acorns up if they can over the reds because they have less tannins. You guys could actually open up a white oak acorn and eat it. It tastes a little bit like a macadamia nut. But if you pop a red oak acorn in your mouth, you'll spit it out immediately. It's so bitter. And deer prefer whites over red. But if I were hunting, let's say, in an area where there were 2 or 3 white oaks, and then there were along the edge of the security cover, there were some red oaks, but the white oaks were out a little more out in the open with no security cover around them. I'd set my location up at the red oaks because it's close to the security cover. A mature buck is likely going to come and feed on some red oak acorns because he's got a quick exit into security cover, as opposed to being vulnerable out here eating white oak acorns in the daytime, where he has to cover a pretty big bit of ground before he hits security cover if he's shot at. And that's just the way big deer think. That's the way you would think if people were shooting at you as well.
Oh, I'm glad they're not. I'd already be.
Yeah, but
I'd be that 2-year-old on the wall. You know what I mean?
That's funny. John, on the topic of bedding, that's so fascinating that we're talking about this subject, because I have a property that me and another buddy lease. It's 110 acres. If you walked into this property and you were trying to sell it like to somebody that didn't hunt, it would be the biggest piece of dump, nasty looking place that no one would want to buy it if they weren't a deer hunter. But we leased this property 3 years ago. We've hunted it 3 times. All it is like 10-foot tall Johnson grass, and tree limbs fell over. It's basically 100 acres of bedding. In 3 hunts there, we've killed a 7.5-year-old buck, another 7.5, and a 6.5-year-old buck. And I was like, it opened my mind to just hey, it doesn't matter if I have food or if I have everything else. If I can get in a big buck's bedroom where he feels safe walking anytime during the day, I can kill him. And we've hunted 3 times and killed 3 bucks that old.
That's amazing. Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard of that high a percentage, but that doesn't surprise me that was the case, because security covers, it's all about security cover, man. They just feel comfortable moving in security cover. You can have all the sign in the world. You could find a location that there's 100 scrapes and 300,000 buck rubs, and but it's along the edge of an open crop field. There's timber along the crop field, but the crop field's in hay, or it's in soybeans, or it's picked corn or whatever. That sign is irrelevant, because a mature buck is not going to come and visit that in the daytime because he's vulnerable. Sure, he's going to visit it after dark, but he's not going to visit it in the daytime. It's all about security. The only time it's not about security if there's a buck physically on a hot doe. Then all that stuff goes out the window. I think if the doe went into Walmart, he'd follow her in.
Yeah, we've seen that. There's some videos of that. Yeah. I was thinking about that. It was crazy because in the world of habitat management, it's really cool to plant food plots and to do all this stuff and, put in kiddie pools for water. People are just doing all these different projects. I felt that way when I stepped onto this lease. I'm like, man, we got to put food over here. We got to bring this in over here. And I was like, you know what? Thankfully, I don't have enough money to do any of these things. So I just left it like it was. And I was like, my buddy has several thousand acres. He was like, I think you're hunting the best piece of ground around here and you're doing nothing to it. It's kind of pissing me off. And I was like, I know it's just crazy to me.
If I had a choice of buying 5 acres of prime bedding ground versus 200 acres of ag mixed with open timber, or just open timber with no understory, no security cover on the ground, I'd take the 5 acres of bedding area any day of the week. Any day of the week. You don't know how many guys send me emails and they got 10 acres or 20 acres of open timber and they never see any mature bucks. They see deer coming in and eating acorns and stuff, but because there's no understory, there's no security cover, they get pictures of them at night, but they never see them in the daytime.
That's exactly what I kind of see. I'm fortunate enough for my family to own, I guess, quite a bit of land, but I would say it's 300 acres, but probably 285 of it is nothing but hay meadow. And granted, they have a pecan orchard on some of it, but kind of like you said, you can get some great pictures, and especially nighttime pictures. For example, just this last season, I had, I think 5 bucks that would be well over Pope and Young. And I was like, if I see one of those, it's going to be tough. But there's one in particular that had flyers going everywhere. Fast forward, I only got pictures of him at night, but he was pretty common. And fast forward a little bit into the season, of course, scrolling through Facebook, matched up the trail cam pictures with the grip and grin that the neighbor was doing about a mile north. And if you look at his property, he only has maybe 10, 20 acres, I think. And I know this isn't very good, quality deer management, but he and his wife and his son killed, I think, 3 or 4 bucks off that place.
4 bucks off that place.
And they were good bucks. That
all
one
of them were
scored like 160 something. And then I guarantee the 8 or 9 point that his son killed was probably at least 130s. But like I have 300 acres that I can hunt, but only 5-10 of it is maybe huntable. And then they got the bedding, and then that's where all the shooters go. So
all about the bedding, man. And a lot of times when you're scouting and you know, like, I kind of have a standing rule up here in Michigan because the public lands here get just pounded to death. There's 40 bow hunters per square mile minimum.
Gosh, dang.
Minimum. And so I have a standing rule. If I can walk to a location, I don't care how much sign is there, I won't set it up because other people will fudge it up for me. Other people will find it as well. So in Michigan, I have to cross creeks and rivers with waders or hip boots before I'll even look at it. A lot of times, once you cross those areas or you go back into a bedding area, the bedding area will open up, and just like you said, Christian, you know, there'll be oaks in there. You know, it's a bedding area, but back within bedding areas, there's little open areas, there's little mounds, there's little hills where there's timber and some trees, maybe some mass trees. And anytime you find relatively dense security cover that's primarily marsh grasses, tall weeds, brush, red brush, whatever the case may be, there's going to be openings. And whenever you find those openings, there's almost always runways going through those because it's a little small area of path of least resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll find scrapes and stuff like that. And if you find, when you can find oaks in a bedding area that are dropping food,
yeah,
it doesn't get any better than that.
Ain't got to move very far, huh?
Yeah.
Well, no, and it's during the daytime. That's the cool thing, you know. Yeah. It's not like it's oaks out in timber like you're talking about, where you get pictures of them at night. They can hit those in the daytime. It's all about daytime activity. You know,
right.
All the pictures in the world are worthless. All the sign in the world is worthless. If it's not made during the daytime by a mature buck, it's irrelevant.
Legally.
Legally.
Well, yeah. I just read an article today about a guy that they caught poaching in Michigan last fall.
Oh, really?
10 counts, yeah.
Good
man.
Gosh.
So while we got you on here, we did want to talk about, I know you're an author about this specific topic, is hunting pressured whitetails, bow hunting pressured whitetails specifically. For people that are listening to the podcast, how would you define a pressured whitetail, and what are the behavior differences between a pressured whitetail and maybe some of these unpressured one that you always see on TV all the time?
Well, pressured means they've been shot at since they've had their first set of antlers. Whether it be
now that's pressured.
Or during gun season, okay? You know, we have 340,000 bow hunters in Michigan. I don't know what Oklahoma is, maybe 100,000. Kansas is like 24,000. Nebraska is like 18,000. So we've got a lot of bow hunters, and the public lands get just pounded to death. And you know, a buck, when he reaches the ages of 3.5-year-olds are rare here on public land, extremely rare. And there's a lot of, you know, like in northern Michigan where it's all sandy soil, 3.5-year-old bucks don't even go 100 inches.
Okay.
They just don't have the minerals in the soil to do that. But they're just really rare, and they've been shot at before. You're never going to find a 3.5-year-old here that hasn't been shot at before. It is just not going to happen. They may not have wounds on them, but like I said, 28 out of my 34 Michigan bucks have had wounds on them or physical projectiles in them when I've skinned them. And I've killed 20 out of state. I have never shot a deer out of state that had a wound in it, ever. Ohio, I've killed a couple in Ohio, and Ohio is a pretty heavily hunted state.
Yeah, it is.
You hunting in Michigan, I assume, just because of the pressure you talk about, you've gotten walked up on once or twice while you're in the stand, right?
Oh, I've had guys walk under my tree.
Yeah.
In fact, one of my most prized bucks, I shot a 14 point at straight up noon. It was on an all-day sit between two bedding areas. It was a transition zone between bedding areas. And I had a guy walk under my tree at 10:30. We've just gotten 2 inches of snow. I've just got 2 inches of snow. But it was kind of warm. It was a very wet snow. It was like 34 degrees, 33 degrees. And this guy come walking through the woods, He's wearing a red plaid shirt and blue jeans. He had leather boots on. I always look at everything when somebody's walking through. He had leather. I really noticed the leather boots because that leaves the odor big time. And he had a bow, carrying a bow. And when he got under the tree, I yelled down at him, and he looked up the tree, and I said something again because he wasn't looking high enough. He looked up and he finally saw me, and I said, "Man, I'm hunting here. I appreciate it if you leave." So he ended up, when he left.
Was it that nice?
Yeah. So anyway, when he left, he walked out one of my shooting lanes. He walked right through one of my pretty wide shooting lanes. So I'm sitting there and I'm like, God, do I get down? Do I leave? You know what? No, I'm between two bedding areas. So if there was a deer in that bedding area or that bedding area and they're going to transition through here, they didn't see this guy because he's going through the gap. He's going through the gap between the two bedding areas because they were dense and he didn't want to walk through the crap with his stuff. And so I decided to wait. And by 11:30, the snow had melted. And I was after this particular buck. I've been pursuing him for 3.5 years. And the only times I had ever seen this deer was during the middle of the day. I never saw him in the morning or in the evening, always in the middle of the day. So here he comes. I see this buck coming out of this bedding area, coming from the north, heading south. I don't know which way the wind was blowing, by the way. It was after my scent control. So he's coming north to south, and he's going to go right through that shooting lane where that man walked through. So he walked right dead through the center of that shooting lane, and that shooting lane was relatively wide. It was probably 6 feet wide. So I'm watching, and it was on my left side, so I'm right-handed, so it was perfectly right there. I didn't even have to move around in my saddle. And as the buck's nose is coming into the shooting lane, I drew my bow, and as soon as his chest was partially exposed, I did a meh and stopped him and took that shot because I knew if he took one step more, he was going to smell where that man walked those legs.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've had guys walk under me quite a few times. Actually.
Yeah. So that's kind of where I was getting at. You said on that hunt, you decided to stay. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to ask is like, what makes you like kind of decide like whether to stay or whether to go to like maybe a backup you have on down?
It would be very, very rare that I would leave. Cause in a bedding, if I'm in a bedding area during the rut phases and somebody goes by, bedding areas on public land are usually huge. So the odds of him spooking every deer in it is probably pretty slim. And, me getting down and leaving and going someplace else, I'm probably not going to do any better. So I just usually stick it out. Now there's been many times where I've been in a tree on an all day sit, seen activity someplace else, maybe a couple 100 yards back farther in some other area.
Right.
And while I'm saddle hunting, and I'll actually pull my stuff going down the tree, and I'll slowly and methodically move back to that area and get up. My biggest buck I ever shot, 180 incher, was one of those. I got down out of the tree at about 10:30 because I was seeing activity farther back, about 200 yards closer to the big river. And I moved back there and found a big primary scrape area that I had never seen before. And I set up on it and I shot that buck that evening.
Was that in Michigan?
That was in Iowa. Biggest buck I got in Michigan was a 167 net, and that was a state record.
Good God.
I was for 5 years, actually.
That's awesome.
That's crazy.
167 in a lot of states, in a lot of counties in Iowa, they won't even lift their bow off the rack for that.
Oh yeah. If I ever get there, I'm just going to hang it up.
Lift their bow up.
So have you ever encountered like a place on public where it has heavy pressure and some areas of the property have very heavy pressure, some areas have very minimal pressure? Like we were hunting a place in 2020 where it seemed like if you sit on that first ridge in that mountain habitat, those deer are skittish. They're spooking when they're walking in, they're looking up at trees. But if you go 400, 500, 600 yards back on that secondary ridge system, it's like you're walking up to a petting zoo. Like those deer, you walk up to them, they take a few steps and they just stop. They're like, hey, what's going on here? Have you ever noticed that on public lands? Like just very small differences, but these deer act completely different.
Not really in Michigan. Although I take that back. Anytime I go across a river with waders or a canoe or go across a lake in a boat, obviously I'm going to a secluded area where they feel more comfortable moving in the daylight, because if I stayed on the side where all the hunting pressure is, not only are they not going to be looking in trees, they're not going to be there. They're not going to be there in the first place, because, the hunting pressure actually pushes deer back into those remote bedding areas where you have to, work harder than everybody else to get back to them. So in that kind of scenario, yeah. And I've hunted a lot of hill country down where you're talking about. I've never really noticed it in hill country, other than it seems like, because some of those sections are huge, they're miles. It seems like the farther you go back in, the less concerned about human activity deer have.
Mm-hmm.
So that, the closer you get, once you get half a mile back, you've lost a lot of your hunting competition. And I think the deer realize that, just like once they cross a river and go into a bedding area, they feel a lot more comfortable moving in the daytime. So yeah, that kind of plays out anywhere. There's lots of areas in Michigan where there's people with leased property and big family farms where they're managing it, and they kill nice deer every year. Whereas a property a mile and a half away from that, everybody in the section, there's 20 property owners in the section. They all own 5 to 20 acre parcels, and they all have 1 or 2 guys hunting in it. So there's 30 bow hunters in trees opening day, and that's a pressured zone where a mile away, this guy owns 600 acres and, manages it, and he hunts it by himself. So the deer, once they're on his property, they feel very comfortable. I was talking to a guy, actually maybe 6 months ago. Somebody sent me an email, and I think he was from Ohio, and he was hunting public land next to this old man. This old man owned a farm, and he didn't hunt at all, but he didn't let anybody hunt. And he had a hayfield out back, and this guy would sit on this public land, and he would see this monster buck come out into that hayfield every afternoon and just come out in that wide open hayfield and just eat. And he would never, ever come close to the fence on the public land side.
He knew.
And he said one time he got a picture of that buck on the public land, but it was like at 1 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
But there on that scenario, you got a deer that's totally oblivious to hunting pressure as long as he's on that guy within his fences, whereas he knows on the other side of the fence it's danger. And they usually learn that as they grow up. I mean, they never forget how, some people say deer don't have memories, but deer have really good memories.
Dang elephant.
Yeah, they definitely do. So one of the things that I think has gotten extremely popular in the deer hunting space is these out of state 1 week trips. Wherever you want to go. You live in the South, maybe you go to the Midwest. You live in the Midwest, you stay in the Midwest because that's where all the big deer are. What do you, for folks that can do minimal scouting and, really their only time allotted to going and checking out that place is when they're hunting? Like, what do you think is some of the reasons that, or some of the main struggles that people that are doing these 1 week out of state trips have, and what's something that maybe they could do to fix those? Because I know the majority of, you said a lot of your hunts on your website are those 1 week type of hunts. What allows you to be successful on those?
Well, typically if I'm going by myself, which I did for years, they were usually 7 days. When I go with my boys now, we always do 11-day hunts, because usually it's a day of travel on each end, and then the first 2 days we scout. But I never went out of state and pre-scouted the property and then came home and went back on it. Never, ever. And I went on probably close to 30 out of state hunting trips. So when I go out of state, I always scout it the first day, if not day and a half. If I'm happy with what I've scouted out and prepped the first day, and it's hard to scout a decent piece of property and prep 2 or 3 locations in a day. That's very difficult to do. So usually it's at least a day or a day and a half. And so anymore, I try to plan, even if I go by myself, I try to plan 8 to 10 days. I think, as long as you're going to take a vacation, a week is just a nice, neat little package. Okay. Leave on a Friday and stay through 2 weekends, make it a 10-day trip. That way you don't feel rushed. Anytime you go out and you feel rushed, you feel like, well, I'm only going to scout this morning because I want to hunt this evening.
Bad decisions get made.
You're just anxious. And if you give yourself a couple extra days to get your scouting and location prep done, and then you hunt accordingly, I think you'd be a lot more successful, because a lot of people just put too much pressure on themselves, because you're going to have a travel day on each end usually. So if you're looking at, 5.5 days, including the first evening of hunts, plus you got to do all your scouting in that time frame, that's just too much pressure, in my opinion.
That's a really good point. I think we've always got to do quite a bit of, summer and like mainly summer scouting on these places, because a lot of the states we're hunting are border states, right? States like Kansas. Right. And one of the things, the pitfalls that we've fallen into is like, we get really good trail cam pics in the summer, whether in their daylight, whether they're not in the daylight, but we get married to these spots based on these trail cam pictures. And it's like, I can't go sit anywhere else. Like, look, this was here 3 months ago. Like how do you get out of that? Like, is it just trusting yourself as a bow hunter and saying like, well, I know for these reasons that deer is not going to be here now, and I just have to go through that process? Or what do you do?
Absolutely. I don't care. I mean, if I were in that same scenario and I saw these summer pictures of these big bucks, bucks move during the course of a year. In the summer, they may have a totally different preferred feeding location than they do, during early season or during the rut phases. They're going to change. A guy just sent 2 days ago, I get about 50 emails a day asking me hunting questions, okay? And a guy sent me an email 3 days ago, and it was a snippet of a study from Mississippi, University of Mississippi. And they studied, this was not a captive deer. But it was a mature buck, and he was living on, his main living space during the winter was would have been on the east side of the Mississippi River, maybe a mile.
We just read this. Yep.
Yeah, I heard of that.
That deer traveled 14 miles to summer. He summered. He crossed the river, which is almost a mile wide. He crossed the river and went several miles on the west side of the river, and he summered there because that was a preferred feeding area for him. And then he'd come back across the river during October and into the rut phases to be in his core, rut phase area. So summer pictures out in open areas, you got to keep in mind, if it's in an open area, once hunting season gets there and there's any semblance of hunting pressure, he's going to move into security cover areas. So that open area where he was feeding, that's pretty much meaningless unless there's a bedding area right next to that open area where he's feeding. Then that would be definitely a target zone.
Didn't they say that buck with that whole trip was basically, I guess they wrapped it up into a word of like an excursion?
Yeah.
Isn't that what that buck did? And you said it did come back across during the fall?
Yep. I think it was a 2-year study on the same deer. They had him collared, and he would go 14 miles from where he would summer from where he would.
That's
I mean, that's pretty normal up in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan and in
really?
Wisconsin. Yeah, deer will, because there's no ag up there whatsoever. So everything is either browse or mast. And when they get, it's not odd for them to get, 15 feet of snow during the course of a winter. Of course, that packs down. So the deer actually move to yarding areas in like late November, early December. They will move 14, 15, sometimes 20 miles to cedar swamps, where cedars kind of protect them from the wind in the winter. And also cedars have a canopy, and they love eating cedar boughs. I don't know, you talked about cedars in that bedding area you were at, but cedars are a main food source in the winter up here in northern Michigan.
That's interesting.
Cedar boughs, it's huge. I mean, you can drive down the roads, and if you see a cedar swamp, there will be a browse line, and it'll be like a ruler going across. Straight line is browse line.
That's nuts. The GPS stuff is so fascinating to me. I was reading one on the National Deer Association's website the other day, and they were talking about how different bucks, there's basically like two main personality styles on bucks. Like there's one style that's like homebodies, and there's another that are like these excursion bucks. Like they have 3 different home ranges throughout the year. Like they're living completely separate lives in different parts of the seasons. And it's so interesting to me because as a bow hunter, it's almost like you have to rely more on your woodsmanship than what your trail cameras can tell you, because now it's like the trail cams aren't telling you where to hunt. They're giving you a piece of information to add into that bigger picture of what's going on with the sign and the scouting and all those things. But it's so hard. There's so many trail camologists, and I'm probably one of them this year, but it's hard to give that up and go on what you know to be true, because it's not what you see, right? Like that's faith. It's trust in yourself.
It's kind of interesting because I became a trail cam junkie too. And if you read any of my books, I'm very anti motion camera, because it was always, like I said earlier, they were always cameras you had to physically visit and change the cards on. Yep. Well, now with cell cameras, that's not the case. You can, I go in and I'll put them 14 feet up the tree where they're out of their peripheral vision, shooting down on a destination feeding location typically, and I can tell what the inventory is. And when we go to Kansas, we put a camera at every single location. We're actually putting them at our hunting locations. And, whether there's multiple runways converging, or typically it's a primary scrape area, so we got it over the scrapes. And we hunt according to what we see on camera when we're in Kansas, because it's so much easier. There's so many mature bucks. They compete a lot more for breeding rights because there's so many, dominant mature bucks. It's nothing like here. And basically if we see a deer on camera one evening, we'll be in that tree the next evening if it's a deer we want to target. So we totally hunt cameras when we're in Kansas. I don't hunt cameras here. I usually in Michigan. I put cameras in inventory locations just to see what's in the area.
Yeah. How many of those cell cams have you got stolen? Because I feel like if we were to hang a cell cam up in public, that's easy grabs, because we've had a couple stolen in Oklahoma, and we didn't have any stolen in Kansas, but we did have a couple of SD cards removed. And so we kind of got the hint on that to kind of back out of there. But
were they cell cameras that you had the cards removed?
No, just cheap SD cameras.
Yeah, they're just like knockoff SDs, but yeah.
On public land, I use Browning, just $100 second ops cameras, cheap cameras.
I getcha.
But when we're hunting in Kansas, I've got 2 farms out there that I hunt. We always use the Kodaks out there, and we'll usually have. I think this last year we had 12 cameras up in Kansas, and 4 of them were Brownings on walk-on. I don't think we hunted any public land. I killed a buck on walk-on property. I went back because I didn't kill one on our November hunt. My son John did on his very first sit. I didn't. Everything I wanted to shoot was busted to hell. So I went back by myself in mid-November, and I actually posted a YouTube video because I have a YouTube channel. I shot one on November 15th, and it was in 35 to 40 mile an hour winds, and it was 13 degrees.
Oh my God.
The tree was blowing like crazy. I had to wait for the tree to stop while I was at full draw to take the shot. And I was actually using an old abandoned house that was abandoned in 1985. And I was using that as a pinch point. So this house, I actually videoed the house while I'm in the tree. My tree is literally 4 yards from the front door of the house.
So that's like a Michigan version of like Seek One.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, well, Seek One is he's a pretty big,
they do like suburban hunting.
Yeah. Seek One does like suburban hunting, and like they'll basically go to like housing additions, like around lakes or whatever, and hunt like 10 yards from a person mowing or something and kill giants. So that's basically like the Michigan Seek One.
Yeah, an old house. I don't consider that. Hunting in suburbia is pretty easy. But anyway, this was in Kansas. This was not in.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Not in Kansas. And I actually videoed the house because the roof's got holes in it. The place is falling apart. But the house was 4 yards to my northeast. There was a bedding area to the northwest of the house, maybe 80 yards away. And then to the southeast, there was a crop field about 3/8 of a mile away, probably. So the deer coming out of that bedding area to the northwest came around, and they were skirting the edge of this house because all of the vegetation and brush that they had around the house back in the 80s, this is all overgrown now. This house is totally encapsulated with brush and weeds.
That's pretty cool, though.
Circling the edge of this house, going right around the corner of it, en route to that crop field to the southeast. And so that's where I put my tree and shot it.
I never would have thought of that. That is really cool.
It was cool too.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know you've mentioned it several times throughout the podcast, but let's talk a little bit about primary scrapes. Like, what makes what a primary scrape area is one, like, what is a primary scrape area? And like, can you just explain that?
Yeah, sure. A primary scrape area is typically a zone. It's going to be a little bit of an open zone, and it's going to have multiple scrapes within this zone. I've seen as many as, oh God, what's the most scrapes I've seen? Maybe 11 within a 30-yard zone. Now, most primary scrapes area are within a 10-yard zone, 10-yard area, but they are always 100% of the time. There's social activity areas for one. They're usually perennial. They're there every single year, but they're always located where there's an influx of doe activity, because that's where the bucks lay their sign, is where there's a lot of doe activity. And that's where they pick up, that's one of the areas they'll visit during pre-rut when they start, looking for those early estrus does. And they'll do that in the daytime. They'll visit those scrape areas in the daytime if the adequate security cover around the perimeter of the scrape area is there, and there's adequate transition security cover to that scrape area from a known bedding area. So if there's a primary scrape area, let's say there's a primary scrape area on the edge of a crop field. So I'm scouting, here's a bunch of scrapes on the edge of a crop field. There's 4 or 5 scrapes next to some bushes, because they're always going to be under some semblance of a tree or a bush, because they have overhanging licking branches that are scent marked as well. And let's say there's 100 yards of open timber on the timber side of this crop field, and then there's a bedding area. Okay, and let's say that crop field is in standing corn this year that I'm gonna set this up, and this year that crop field's in standing corn. Okay, if there's a deer in the bedding area and he's one of the main users of this primary scrape area, he is not going to, during daylight hours, get up and go through that open, vulnerable timber to work one of those scrapes. He's just not going to do it, because he's going to be too vulnerable. He may come out of the corn because it butts right up to it and work a scrape, but he's not going to come out of that. So, that's a primary scrape area that I probably wouldn't hunt, unless if I were going to hunt that when it was in standing corn, because I want to try to pull something out of the corn. I'd probably do a rattle sequence or a sparring sequence in conjunction with sitting at that. But usually by the rut phases, that corn's going to be down. So that spot's going to be 100% worthless as soon as the corn's cut, because there's not going to be any deer bedded in the pit cornfield. You with me on that?
Yeah.
Most of the time, you're going to find primary scrape areas at feeding locations, around perimeters, crop fields, at oak trees, where there's maybe, just like I mentioned earlier, there's just a few oak trees. So it's a primary, it's a major destination spot because there's only a few of them. A lot of does are going to be feeding in that area, so they may lay down some scrapes around that area, or at an apple tree, or in the south, a persimmon tree. But it's primary. It may be, let's say, at the base of a ridge. It could be at a terrain feature dump, where you've got the base of a ridge kind of swings around and it butts up into a bedding area. That's going to be a spot where there's going to be a lot of doe activity coming along the base of the ridge and then filtering down into the bedding area. That's where there's going to be some scrapes probably. So There's a lot of different things and places a scrape area could be. It could be in a pinch point, between a bedding and a feeding area. You got a big area of timber, and you got a feeding area over here. And then there's some decent transition security cover between the bedding and the feeding area. Where that pinches down the narrowest, there's likely going to be scrapes there, because that's a funnel, a pinch point of doe activity. So there's a lot of doe traffic going through that pinch. That's why there would probably be scrapes there. But they're always around areas where there's a lot of doe activity.
So it sounds like kind of the art with the primary scrape areas is understanding which one of those a mature buck is going to utilize during daylight hours, and which one of those he's going to hit, but it just might not be when you can capitalize and kill him.
That's the art of deer hunting, period. Knowing when to hunt what, and does it have the adequate security cover for a mature buck to visit it in the daylight.
Yeah, and
that's why bedding areas are so key, because they are 100% daylight oriented because they're in security cover already.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the issues, and one of the things we're still growing in, like bow hunting. I've been bow hunting for 13 years, and I'm still learning to discern, like, okay, just because an area has sign, that doesn't mean that's somewhere you need to be up in a tree. You know, like, you still have to be able to discern that, and that's kind of one of the biggest battles for me. It's like, do I leave sign to find sign, like all that stuff. So that's good to hear, though. That I think that is the art of deer hunting, right? Is finding that.
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah, being able to differentiate what is daylight activity and what's nighttime activity by a mature buck. You know, I don't know how many times I've done seminars or put up Facebook posts or YouTube videos, and I'll say, well, you know, you need to do this or this to kill mature bucks. And somebody will reply, well, I don't do that, and I see bucks. And my reply is always, what kind of bucks are you seeing? You know, if you're seeing 1.5 and 2.5 year old bucks, and that's what your goals are, that's wonderful. I'm happy for you. That's great. You know, but if your goals are killing 3.5, you know, mature bucks, 3.5, 4.5, you know, where you guys are at, you have 6.5 and 7.5 year old bucks. We don't have that here.
Mm-hmm.
But if that's your goal, you have to look for the type of sign, and you have to hunt smart and know when to hunt it. And you have to know if that spot is going to be something he will move to or move through during daylight hours. Being able to differentiate daylight activity from nighttime activity is a big part of killing mature bucks.
For sure. We had a guy, Alan, that's like a super fan of you, and he sent us a bunch of questions that he wanted to ask you. But yeah. I've got a couple that I think are really good ones, because I think we've covered a lot of the topics. He talked about your book, Bow Hunting Pressured Whitetails. If you rewrote this book today, would there be anything different that you would say in the book, and what would that be?
Huge difference. In fact, that's what I'm doing right now. Like I mentioned, I'm writing a book. Yeah. I mean, if you looked at Bow Hunting Pressured Whitetails, which was published in 2003, versus Bow Hunting Whitetails the Eberhart Way, which was my third book published in 2010, there's a lot of differences in those two books. There's a lot more. Hunting has changed. Hunting has evolved over the years because of hunting pressure, and people are targeting more mature bucks, and there's more leases. You know, it's harder to get, hunting permission. Public land's more pressured because everything else is getting leased. So hunting is evolving, not necessarily for the better, but it's still evolving. So you have to change. So there's a lot of things in my 2010 book that are not in the 2003 book. And that's going to be the same with this book. This is going to be a 13-year time gap between 2010 and now. And I've got a lot more information and a lot more detailed information in what I'm going to be putting out, hopefully this fall or next spring, from what I did in 2010. So as far as picking a certain thing, cornfields, in 2003, I was doing a lot of rattling, but I was primarily doing it in bedding areas. When I say rattling, I'm not talking about rattling like you see the crazy TV guys doing, where they're just bashing the hell out of antlers, because there's lots of big bucks where they're at and they're used to hearing that. I'm talking about subtle sparring sequences. But I've been doing a lot of sparring sequences along standing corn, and it's been extremely successful for me. So in the 2010 book, I've got a complete chapter on hunting corn. And this book here, I'm going to have chapters on staging areas, which I think I had a chapter on staging areas in that first Bow Hunting Pressured Whitetail books, but I didn't have it in my next two. I'm going to add that again. Because back then, everybody looked at a staging area as a feeding staging area, where bucks would go stage at an area before they entered a crop field. After dark, they would stage close to it. But now my staging area chapter on this book is going to be rut staging areas, where bucks may stay in waiting, in the mornings for does to come out of open areas, vulnerable open areas, and you come through these primary scrape areas, or come into a grove of oaks. They'll stage there and wait for them to come through, so they are not being vulnerable. They're not moving through the timber. They're staying stationary, just waiting for the does to come through to them. So it's a rut staging area versus a bedding to feeding area, staging area. So there's going to be a lot of new information.
Yeah. Well, I know after he hears what you just said, the next question he's going to ask is, when is that book coming out? Do you all have a time yet?
We're hoping this fall, but man, I'm working on one chapter. I've worked on one chapter for 2 weeks.
Ooh.
Okay. So it's even though it's going to be a book on saddle hunting, this is going to have a ton of hunting information for anybody in the country.
How many hours do you typically have into each book if you were to like break it down, I guess?
Well, the first 3 books I co-authored with my son, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
So he's deceased. He died of cancer a few years ago, but that how many hours? Wow. A lot.
Yeah.
A couple thousand probably.
Goodness.
Wow.
I am very detail oriented. I just don't like to do general statements that anybody can make.
Right.
To explain so a layman can understand what I'm saying. So all the information in my books and my articles, I try real hard to give as much detail so there's no gray areas, if you will.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I know where your first sale of the book's coming from. Our buddy Alan's definitely he's picking up one.
Hey, by the way, I'm going to send you, Christian, all my email documents on scent control, and you can pass them on to Jake.
All right, that sounds good.
I would really like you guys to read at least the first 2 documents out of the 12.
I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
Alan had another really good question. He said it's a 2-part question. So, what equipment has made bow hunting better in the last 30 years, and what has made it worse?
That's a loaded question. Obviously, to me, what's made it worse is to a lot of people what has made it better. Okay, crossbows. Obviously, the advent of full inclusion crossbows has made it better for a lot of people because they never have to practice anymore and they can shoot twice as far as they used to accurately. So that's made it better for a lot of people. I personally feel like crossbows should be in a special season. You know, in Michigan, they used to be, you could use them during gun season, or you could use them if you had some sort of a handicap or a doctor's permit, which that's wonderful. You know, you never want to keep anybody out of the woods.
Right.
If they can't use a compound. But as far as compound bows, what has made it better or worse? I think compound technology is just phenomenal. I'm shooting a 40-pound bow, and it's, you know, with light arrows and a smaller cut, you know, a G5 striker broadhead, fixed blade broadhead, and it's shooting faster than my 65-pound bow that I hunted with in the 70s. You know, when compounds first came out, pretty much. So the technology has advanced big time, and the bows are lighter. There's no vibration to them. I've been on Matthews hunting pro staff for quite a few years, and you know, I shot fingers for years and years and years. For the first 52 years I bow in it, I shot fingers.
Really?
And the only 2 companies that made fingers bows were Hoyt and Matthews. You know, long axle compounds. So, and with finger bows, you have to shoot a lighter let off because you want that pressure against your fingers so it snaps off your fingers. You don't want it to roll off like a 85% let off. So now I'm shooting a release, but you know, that's the one reason I got into Matthews is because they made fingers bows. But you know, all the bow companies make great bows. It's just what feels good to you. The technology is there for, you know, maybe one's 10 feet per second faster than the other.
Yeah.
At the speeds they're shooting nowadays, that's irrelevant.
Yeah, my uncle has he's still got his first bow is a Browning in the 80s. It's from the 80s.
Oh my God.
It's awesome. It's awesome.
Good, isn't it?
Yeah, I tried to pull it back. It's like 80 pounds. I about pulled my shoulder out of socket the first try. It was a challenge like the first 5 years I was bow hunting to get this thing back. I swear you couldn't put both legs on it and pull it back with 2 hands. It's so hard.
Well,
it makes you appreciate it.
50% let off. The early bows back in the early 70s, like Allen made the first one, it was 15% let off.
Good God.
I mean, it actually felt like you're drawing more. I mean, 15% is almost unnoticeable, and it was this big, huge, blocky thing. And then Jennings, you know, they came out with bows, and Allen took that first compound to Fred Bear. And Fred Bear was a purist, So, he was totally against compounds. He felt the compounds like I feel about crossbows. They shouldn't be used in archery season. But anyway, he turned it down. And then several years later, after compounds totally dominated the market, obviously Bear came out with compounds as well.
Right. So I don't want to, I guess, end it on a gloomy note or whatever, but where do you see it going from here? Like, obviously, yeah. Like with all these new gadgets, like now they got like air guns or something where
oh yeah,
you can use air guns. So like it almost seems like a destructive path, but where do you kind of see it heading from here?
Well, I don't think those guns that shoot those bolts out of air guns, they're not legal in many states, are they?
They are in Texas. I've seen people shoot them in Texas.
Well, everything's legal in Texas.
Yeah, I was about to say. I think they're legal in more states than we think, though. Wow. I'm pretty sure because at least that's what the Meat Eater podcast say, because I know they have a few advertisements rolling like in their mid roll on their podcast, and apparently they're getting pretty popular from what the ads are saying.
I know once you legalize something, it's pretty hard to take it away.
Right.
The government, once you give people some sort of a program, they never want to leave it.
You don't say.
They never want to leave it. Like their voters. So I don't know. Unfortunately, I'm at the age where I'll be dead before I have to worry too much about it. Or I won't be able to bow hunt anymore. I work out every day, so I stay in shape for bow hunting, and I'm 72, and I can still climb with most anybody. But I don't know where the technology is going. It seems like compounds are, God, it's just hard to imagine them getting any faster.
Right.
So awesome.
Boy, every year they come up with something that tricks it out a little bit more.
Oh, I know. Trying to grab that next dollar from everybody who buys a bow every single year, but
makes you buy one bow one year, and then come January of the next year, it's worth half as much.
That's what we wait for, at least, but so we're having like a little series, I guess, within this successful season series, and it's just one question. But basically, what's your close but no cigar moment? And that could be from this last season or seasons past. But basically, what's that one moment that one encounter you had with? It could be a giant buck, it could be a spike that you just almost have nightmares about, like where you almost had it, sealed the deal, but close but no cigar, basically.
Oh, I know that one right off the top of my head. 1975.
What happened there?
1975. I was hunting between two hills. The hills had been clear cut, so there was all probably 7-year-old saplings, and it was dense. Deer were bedding in it, and there was a draw between these two hills, and the draw was just kind of weeds. And I was hunting in an oak right kind of at the end of the draw where it goes out into a big open CRP field. And I'd had 10 or 11 does and fawns, and I think one 4-point come out of the saplings down into the draw and kind of transition right underneath the tree I was in within like 10 yards. And about an hour before dark, and it was a bright sunny day. It was just a beautiful day. About 140 incher, which for Michigan back then, it was rare to see a 2.5 back then, because we had $1 million. It killed everything. Nobody passed on a 3-inch spike horn back then. So 2.5s were rare. And this 140 incher was probably a 4 or 5.5-year-old, because it was in northern Michigan where there's sandy soil.
Been shot like 6 times.
Yeah.
I don't know how many times he's been shot, because I never killed him to find out. But he came out of the saplings way up at the end, and he's coming down through the draw, and he's on the same route all those does had went. So I'm, and this is kind of getting into late October, pre-rut. And he's kind of checking those does, and he stops at about 35 yards. And I had a 35-yard pin on my bow. I had a Bear Polar 2 at the time. And I shot leagues, and I was really good at 35 yards. And he's standing there broadside in the sun. And I drew my bow. I put my 35-yard pin on him. And I said, you know what? He's on this runway. Why take this 35-yard shot? He's going to come right down here following these does and give me a 12-yard chip shot. So I let up, and he stood there for about another 10 seconds. And all of a sudden, he just bolted up the side of this hill, up on this one hill, up into the edge of the saplings. And I noticed when he started going up the hill, I saw doe. I looked up there, and I saw doe just inside the saplings kind of take off. I did not know it was there. But when he stopped at 35 yards, he must have heard something up there. And then, anyway, the short story is I missed an opportunity that I know I could have capitalized on because I wanted a better shot. So I learned at that point in time, if I'm pretty positive I can make the shot, take it and don't assume you're going to get a closer shot later, later on that set.
Yeah, that
fuck gave me nightmares because it was the biggest fuck at that time that I'd ever had an opportunity.
Oh yeah, dadgum. Well, that's awesome. It's not awesome, but it's a good story.
No, it is awesome because you never forget those mistakes. When you make mistakes like that, you never forget them. There's no way of learning, no better way of learning than making a mistake and having to remember it.
Oh yeah, no, I get it.
Yeah, I'm still learning a lot, I guess you could say.
Yeah, we all are. Things change, man.
Yeah.
If you quit learning, you become stagnant. Or if you think you know it all, you become stagnant.
So, John, I know it's getting late where you're at. We've been on for almost 2 hours. I really appreciate you jumping on and talking about everything under the sun, deer hunting with us.
Yeah.
For folks that want to connect with you on social media, want to check out your courses, your books, all your programs, all the good stuff that you got going on, where's the best place to do that?
Okay, well, my workshops, the first 2 workshops are full. I still have some openings in my late April workshop, and those are on my website at deer-john.net. That's my website. As far as my YouTube show, that's Eberhart Outdoors. And my books are on my website as well, books and instructional DVDs. And I don't know when this next book's coming out, so hopefully this fall, but as slow as I am right now, and I'm working on this thing all day, every day, because I'm retired from my regular job. We want it to be this fall, but it may not be till spring.
Yeah, that's awesome. I got to say before you go, I really like the YouTube channel. Jake, John has anything from working out to the van that he kills all these big bucks in. I mean, it's got everything on there.
I try to put up just a lot of good, solid general information.
Yeah.
That's my goal, to help hunters kill deer. I love it when I get emails and pictures, and I post them on Facebook of other hunters. They send me their pictures, and I always ask them to write a short story. I always tell everybody, anytime you kill a deer, you should write a short story about it, about the kill and what went on, what type of terrain, what time of day, where were you hunting? And it's just something to always remember your hunt by. And you never know. There may come a day when, you're writing articles or whatever, and you got that right there, as your background for that particular deer. I didn't go to college. I sucked at English, and now I'm a writer.
Hey, there you go.
English was my worst subject.
Well, awesome. John, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been a blast. It's been a blast.
All right, so we're post episode here. Pretty awesome conversation with John. That dude's like a encyclopedia of deer hunting.
No, so right after it, we got out of that broadcast because John was still in there and stuff. So we immediately called each other and we're like, dude, this was such a great episode. And the way we explained it was almost like a different tier of conversation. You know what I mean? And Granted, you can listen to multiple conversations and multiple podcasts that John's a part of, because heck, there's a multitude of them out there. Yeah. But it's just him answering your questions directly. And it's just because no disrespect by this, but I was a little skeptical of the scent control, him wearing, and I know he said it wasn't 100% scent free, which I agree with, but just the way he explains it, the way he answers your question, he's so well versed and he, like, knows his stuff. It's just like, maybe there is something to this. You know what I mean?
Who knows? On the I when he started quoting like Rutgers and a bunch of like research that they had done about like activated carbon technology, like I've heard that verbiage a lot regurgitated, but it's like when you get someone that is an expert on something like that and you get to sit down with them one-on-one and be like, you not only do you get to ask them a question, you get to follow up question, right? And you get to tell them like, this is how I grew up hunting. This is my success, but based on playing the wind. And like, the thing is like, he has 54 years of experience to draw from, and 35 of that is playing the wind how we hunt. So he has like this yin and the yang of the two differences. Am I going to be one of those people that's completely convinced just after hearing it? No, but it's something I would take to my crappy spots and try.
Yeah,
I would definitely try it.
I mean, I truly think there's like something to it now. And like what I was telling you on the phone earlier, just like it was almost like whenever Joe Rogan interviewed Elon Musk, you know what I mean? Like there's a difference in knowledge right there. Like as a hunter, we all like to think we know stuff, but that man knows his stuff. Like whether you're a fan of him or not, I don't know why you wouldn't be a fan of him because he's a super nice guy, but it's almost like mind boggling.
It is. It's weird to a lot of times. I feel like you've been around people that have hunted for a long period of time, but they don't know how to verbalize it in a way that is meaningful to you and where you can like take action off of it. John is like a master at taking what you ask and giving you like an immediate action that you can take based on what you asked
right.
him. Like he's a beast at it.
It was, I don't want to like say it any disrespect to the other guests, but that might've been the best one so far. Like 100%.
I learned the most. One of the things I was telling Jake once right when we got off was I'm going to take some of the things he said and immediately change some of the things that I was hunting, especially the analogies that he had about bedrooms, about driveways, about back doors, front doors. Like that just makes sense in my terms.
This is one, like, even though we heard it firsthand, like it's one that I'll probably go re-listen to possibly 2 other times just to try to really soak this all up, because there was so much like, and in a way I kind of felt bad because like you said, at the very end, like we were all over the place. Like I feel like we talked about deer hunting, all types, all under the sun,
Yep.
And it's just like, that's a lot to soak in. So, I mean, I'm definitely going to listen to this like at least 1 or 2 more times.
Maybe the folks that are enjoying this episode will listen to it multiple times. I hope so. Alan, this one's for you, buddy. Got a lot of your questions in there. Thank you for sending those over. Yeah. I think a lot of the folks that listen are really going to enjoy this episode with John. Think how you will about scent control. I'm not saying that I'm buying a scent lock suit tonight, but I'm saying I am going to do more research, and John is an awesome guest.
Absolutely.
Thank you guys so much for checking out the Hunter's Advantage podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to the podcast. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you in the next episode.